Thank you for attending the webinar. My name is Sherri Flynn. A little bit about me. I am certified ISO 22301 lead implementer and a master business continuity planner. I've worked within business continuity and incident planning, risk, and vendor management for about 20 years now. My primary industry has been in the financial industry, but I have worked with a variety of industries, including manufacturing as well as healthcare. I work for RecoveryPlanner, a business continuity management software and consulting provider based in Trumbull, Connecticut. Today, I'm going to talk about vendor contingency planning. Now, companies can't do everything by themselves, and more often than not, rely on vendors the same way your internal departments rely on each other. This session is not just about checking off a box and saying I have my vendor's DR plan. This is about all of your vendors that can potentially interrupt business by not being available in support of your critical business function. The same way you plan for a department interruption, you should have a plan in place for a vendor interruption, a vendor outage, or what would just happen if they just simply went out of business. We need to treat vendors and third-party providers as part of our company, people on your team, because that's the way your customers will. And in this time of the pandemic, our reliance on third-party providers has really been tested, as most companies have likely experienced. During this session, we'll talk about the difference between vendor management and vendor contingency planning, how to use the information you may already be collecting during the BIA to identify vendors that support your critical business function. We'll also touch lightly on vendor risk assessments, and we'll provide a basic example if you are a company that currently does not do this formally. We'll talk about how to evaluate your vendors on their continuity and planning. And once you make the determination of what your vendors mean to your business continuity planning, how to manage them going forward. We will spend the majority of our time on the BIA and vendor continuity. The other areas are typically found in a true risk management or a risk assessment session. Now, there is some overlap between vendor management and vendor contingency planning, but they are different. Vendor management, in that area, you are more attentive to the due diligence, contracts, and making sure that things are up to date, service level agreements, and someone is monitoring them in an ongoing fashion, as well as reviewing internal policies. Now, for vendor management, you may only do some of these things, but you do them for all of your vendors. You may use some type of software to track and report expiration dates and the due diligence information that you're collecting. This may be an area in your company that is centralized, and they take that information and delegate it to others throughout your organization. Now, vendor contingency planning relies on identifying critical processes and the vendors that are associated to them, prioritizing your vendors based on the impacts to those critical processes, tracking of alternate vendors if those vendors are not available, as well as planning for some type of failure or your vendor outage. Now, for vendor contingency planning, you may do planning for some of these vendors. It does not have to include all of the vendors. And of course, it's based on the critical business functions that they are in support of. So who does what at your organization? And do they communicate with each other? Do you work with each other or even base information on similar results and similar directions? And what are those directions and what are those results? The information typically collected on vendors is a really good example of the overlap between vendor management and vendor contingency planning. You have company information that you collect, contact names and phone numbers, the name of the contact in your organization with the relationship to the vendor, the process that the vendor provides to the organization, the service or technology that they provide, and an alternate vendor if there is one that is available. So in your company, think of where planning happens, and if the vendor management area and planning communicate, if they even communicate at all with one another. Now, as we know, the BIA is all about gathering information and then analyzing it. Gather information for the BIA in a methodically consistent, in a way that is repeatable. You want to develop a process that requests the same information for everyone. You don't want to make any assumptions. You'd really be surprised at the information that you gather when you ask open-ended questions. But the key is to be consistent throughout all of the departments that you question. So for example, the same vendor may be used by multiple departments, or multiple departments save money in your organization even by consolidating services once you uncover that those things are happening in the organization. Now, this is a selection of different definitions for a business impact analysis. It's everything from the ISO 22301 standard, 22317, or even reference to the Financial Institution Business Continuity Handbook. All of them provide important elements and terminology that define the BIA, and really you can angle any presentation on any one of these definitions and make that a single focus. These are very basic definitions that everyone on the call is probably familiar with already. Collecting the data that you need from the business units that do the job, always in support of the business. That's what we're going to focus on in this webinar, is in support of the business. We'll take a look at the BIA with a vendor focus. The information gathering stage of the BIA could involve a great number of interviews that one or more people carry out. You need to develop a common approach so that every interviewer gathers the same information from every person interviewed about every process, every system, asset, and every vendor. Now, during the BIA, there's so much good information that's collected. How you organize that information and how you present that information really will help to organize your critical functions and their critical dependencies. So, for example, you might have specialty equipment that your organization uses. It may not be defined as a critical vendor. You might have a maintenance contract, but if something happens and that critical function is unavailable, that's becoming a critical vendor to you in support of the critical business function. You may use something even as simple as using UPS. You can use FedEx as an alternative, or a private courier. It's not just technology vendors. You want to plan for an alternate way to get things done when the critical areas of your business are impacted, and that's what we're going to look at. In a large effort on a business impact analysis, you may identify several vendors and suppliers or other supply chain partners within your business processes. So you might decide to pull these vendors and make a separate worksheet for them. I'm going to show them to you on a single worksheet and how I go about organizing the data. So for example, the slide that you're looking at here, the very first column shows the department. The next column is the critical business function and the criticality and recovery time of that business function. This report also shows you the supporting resources as well as the supporting vendors for the particular critical business function. So once you collect all of that data, it's how you organize it and what you do with it. This report is the same data now organized by criticality. So this report shows you prioritization of all of the business functions in order of what would be determined as the most critical business function, still keeping your resources and still keeping your vendors. You may also take that same data and sort that for the benefit of the technology group. In the first column here, I've taken the technology resources and made that the first column. I added the IT RTO, so your estimated recovery time on the technology side, and incorporated the earliest recovery time that is determined from the business unit during the BIA. So you have a nice opportunity to provide a gap report to your technology group using the data gathered, focusing on the resources, or in this case, the technology. You can do that same thing with your vendors. You want to put your vendors as the focal point. You can also add the vendor's recovery time or the service level that they've contracted with you to provide, and then still include the remainder of the columns, your earliest recovery time and the document supporting them. Also allow you the vendor RTO or service level and the earliest time a business function is required to support your business. And then you can take that information and sort that by criticality based on the recovery time and based on the business impact analysis. So now you have a functional list of your high critical vendors based on the support of the business function. Now, your business continuity and your disaster recovery plans, they may certainly be effective. But if your vendors cannot support your organization as expected, all of those preparations really may not even be enough. Even basic assessment and remediation efforts that are related to critical vendor risk can go a long way to providing functional recovery of your critical functions and services similar to your own business continuity plans and your own disaster recovery efforts. If your organization already does a comprehensive vendor risk assessment, then you want to make sure that those results are shared with the planning groups to be sure that support and continuity of critical business functions are also identified in your organization. And again, I'll reference the pandemic that we're in. This is usually part of the vendor risk assessment as well. You may want to do this again. You may have different answers to those vendor risk questions than you had previously noted in the risk assessment. And if your organization does not currently conduct a formal risk assessment, then even having a very basic assessment can help at least to determine a baseline across all of your vendors. And I will show a very basic example in 1 minute. But first, there are some things to consider that are related to vendor risk management as it relates to your business continuity planning. Vendor impact cannot be completely understood unless you know the criticality of the business functions that are dependent on those vendors. You may be surprised how many vendors you have, understand what they provide, and how the loss of those vendors can impact your business operations. Are your critical vendors using the best of breed companies? Sometimes your vendors might be using startups to save a little bit of money. Are you aware of that? How is your complete supply chain handled from start to finish? These are some things that you want to identify in that supply chain to identify that risk. Now, vendor risk scoring provides you with a value. It certainly is a very important tool. A risk rating is what's provided for a particular vendor. It lets you know how critical that vendor's risks to the organizations are. What it doesn't do is tell you what the vendor is critical for, what department and processes are specifically linked to a particular vendor interruption, and what to do if they fail you. Now, your risk assessments, if you do not currently perform a formal one, they don't have to be fancy or they don't have to be very large. This is a very basic example. In my slide where it has the header identify vendor risk, you would put the name of your vendor and then the following questions and scoring you would apply to that vendor that you're assessing. The first column is defining criticality points. You would rate anything that applies to a 4, then you have high, moderate, and low. And these are some basic definitions that you have that you might want to use. There's a mitigation column, and then the column for the last column on risk is where you would put the scoring in. There are 10 basic questions and categories that are identified in this baseline risk assessment, and then you see along the bottom that they fall into ranges. They simply add it up, and it gives you a very basic baseline for a risk assessment to identify vendor risk. Now, vendor contingency planning, what is this? Well, you likely already have a business continuity, a DR, and crisis management plans, among other plans that you may have within your organization. And you probably also have a total business continuity management program where you're at least testing annually and you're exercising your plans. Vendor contingency planning is really just making sure that your vendors have their plans and that their plans prepare your vendors for interruptions that impact you. It's all about your organization. Vendors need to be considered as partners in continuity planning, just like you would have a department involved in that cycle. You want to make sure that there are teams, that there's tasks, that there's assignments, and that there is simply a plan in place and that it's identified in the event that they cannot support the business functions that you've determined to be critical. Now, usually when I ask customers about their vendor contingency plan, this is usually the answer that I get from most companies. Well, I have a service level agreement. For many years, the main priority was just to have simply a service level agreement. And most do satisfy or provide what they say to be 99.9% availability or something that's similar to that. Many vendors rely on other vendors to provide their services. And although service levels and in the service levels, the penalty clauses, they might be in place in those agreements, but they are not always adequate when it comes to mitigating impacts in the organization that are due to your critical vendor service failure. They are important, but it's all about the penalties and what you get paid if they miss that service level agreement. It likely isn't enough money to cover any business cost or the cost of a critical process outage, especially if it's a revenue-driven process. Vendor continuity risk needs to be recognized and managed within business continuity management. And again, who manages the vendors in your organization? Want to make sure that that communication is between everyone that manages a vendor and everyone that is planning for the vendors. In order to figure out what vendors to plan for, each organization should adopt a method to align with its corporate goals and its mission. As I said, vendors need to be considered as partners in continuity planning. Now, the aim of conducting an assessment is not really at all to pass responsibility of failure to the vendor, but to adequately assess the risk and treat it within acceptable timeframes and limits. Or you do have the option to avoid the vendor altogether. Now, what you'll see on this slide here is the vendor contingency scoring for service risk. It's just an opportunity to assess the risk of your vendor contingency. Where you have the header for this slide would be the name of your vendor. And you'll see that the column for criticality, alternate means, alternate product and service, and easiness to switch. There is a rating below this, a key, that gives you the risk rating for each one of these items. So for criticality, the product or service considered to be essential to the function that you have classified as critical. Alternate means, are there backup procedures? Is there any other way to do the product or service that that vendor provides? Is there an alternative to that product or service? I used the example earlier, FedEx versus UPS. Is there an alternative that is as easy as that, or one that you have to think through? And easiness to switch. How easy is it to switch from one vendor to another vendor for the service or product that's critical? Sometimes, or really most times, there's no alternative, and it's definitely not easy to switch. So it's all about rating that vendor. So you would rate that a higher risk or an extreme risk in the example of this key. Now, a continuity score needs to be evaluated for each service, and due diligence needs to also be exercised. As not all of the pertinent information can be obtained from the vendor, so due diligence is really important. These questions on this slide are just a sampling. They should be drafted in a way to assess the business continuity readiness of a particular vendor. I do have additional questions in the resource area of this presentation at the end, but these 5 questions give you a really good idea of how you can start to ask business continuity readiness questions of your vendor. So you'll see a couple examples. Does the vendor have a business continuity and risk policy? What we're trying to accomplish by asking that question. Do they have documented business continuity plans? As you know, most vendors will not necessarily or easily provide you with their full plan, but you can ask for a table of contents, last update date, and what is covered in their plan. Have they been tested? Perhaps you can ask for the last 3 tests that they conducted and what the scenarios for those tests were. Were they effective? Did they have to retest? And what is the recovery time objective for the 5 most critical business functions that that vendor has? So you're digging a little bit deeper into what their contingency planning process is. And as I said, I'd added additional questions as reference to the end of this presentation. The second part to this is in the continuity score and the risk mapping. So if your service score is high, then you want to take a look at the continuity score with more weight. So if there is no alternative product, if it's not easy to switch, but that vendor is involved in several critical business functions, then you want to put more weight on what they do for business continuity. And you want to do your planning accordingly. The second part is if the risk score is low, then working without that vendor may not require a lot of planning at all. You may decide that if something happens to that vendor, you really can move forward easily. You don't have to necessarily create a business continuity plan for that particular vendor. Now, planning is so important, mainly because your vendor may be critical to you, but you want to make sure that you are critical to them. And if you're not, will they stop everything to support your organization's business functions? Or is that something that you need to do? I would assume that most organizations would want to be in control of what would happen if the vendor lost service and you had to move forward to do your business processes without them. Now, in November of 2019, the Federal Financial Examination Council, the FFIEC, updated their Business Continuity IT Handbook. The last revisions were done in February of 2015. And during that time, the biggest takeaway was something that was called Appendix J. Now, this appendix focused entirely on outsourced technology and the management of third-party providers. Now, I think it's important to mention that, and this documentation is a very good read for all industries, which is why I'm showing it in this webinar today. That update of Appendix J, it's no longer included in the update. And that was a very big deal because it mainly focused, as I said, the outsourced technology and management of third-party providers. But it was an appendix. The updates are now throughout the entire documentation. It's embedded in the resilience of an organization. And I do recommend that people take a look at it. I will just address how it's relevant to vendor continuity planning here, but it's a really good read throughout. The guidance is all about business continuity management and how organizations need to be resilient, as I said. and how vendors and your third parties are important to your overall resiliency and, as I said, embedded into your overall planning, treated simply as if they are another department or another arm of your organization. I did also want to include some ISO standards. 22318. This is a guideline for supply chain continuity, and this approach is broken into 5 stages, which align to the 22301 business continuity management and 22317 business impact analysis. Now you'll see here to develop a strategy regarding supply chain continuity, analyze the supply chain using the business impact analysis, and identify an approach to manage disruption. Integrate what you learn with your business continuity plan, and you also want to make sure, as with anything else, that it is ongoing, that you're delivering continuous improvement. FIEC handbook that was updated in November of 2019. Very good reference for you here. The Business Continuity Service Standards and Risk is white papers are a reference for ISACA. It's a very good reference when you're looking up continuity and vendor information. I also included here a second set of questions for asking due diligence on the business continuity side for your vendors when you are determining who you need to establish a plan for. Thank you very much for your time. Again, my name is Sherri Flynn with RecoveryPlanner. If you have any questions, my contact information is available on this screen.